In the world of business, speed is everything. But when it comes to something as big as a merger, the traditional path has always felt more like a marathon, not a sprint. So what if there was a way to cut through all that and streamline the whole process? Well, that's exactly what we're talking about today, the fast-track merger.
So here's our game plan for this explainer. We'll start by looking at the problem, the old, slow way of doing things. Then we'll introduce the fast-track solution and see who gets to use it. We'll put it head-to-head with the traditional route, and finally, we'll look at the challenges that still exist and what's on the horizon.
All right, so to really get why the fast-track merger is such a big deal, we first need to understand the problem it was built to solve, and it's a pretty significant one.
Just take a look at this number, 12 to 24 months. That's 1 to 2 years. That's the typical amount of time a company would spend navigating a merger through the old, court-driven process. In today's market, that's not just slow, it's an absolute eternity.
See, historically, every single merger had to get the green light from the High Court, or more recently, the National Company Law Tribunal, what we call the NCLT. And as you can imagine, this created a massive bottleneck. The whole process was slow, it was incredibly expensive, and it really held back the kind of agility businesses need to grow.
And that, of course, brings us to the modern alternative. This is the strategic solution that was designed from the ground up to just slice through all that red tape and complexity.
So what is a fast-track merger, or FTM? Well, the most important thing to know is that it's a non-judicial process. What that means is it's handled by administrative bodies, like a regional director, instead of getting bogged down in the courts. The whole point is to make corporate restructuring simpler and faster, really leaning into that idea of ease of doing business.
So why do companies go this route? Well, the strategic goals are pretty clear. It's a great way to consolidate your corporate structure, find some serious cost savings, and, this is the big one, slash the merger timeline down to around 120 days. That kind of speed is a total game changer if you're trying to grow quickly through acquisitions.
Now, this change didn't just happen overnight. The whole journey started decades ago. You had the 1956 Act, with that super slow court process. Then in 2005, a key committee suggested, hey, maybe there's a better way, and recommended a non-judicial route. That idea eventually led to Section 233 in the 2013 Companies Act, which officially created the FTM. And it's still evolving, with recent changes making it available to even more companies.
Okay, so this all leads to a really important question. Who actually gets to use this express lane? Let's take a look at the kinds of companies that are now eligible for the fast-track process.
And the scope here is actually pretty broad. It covers the classic scenario, a holding company merging with its subsidiary, but the really big news is that it now includes small companies and startups, which is a massive boost for innovation. The list also covers some unlisted companies and even foreign holding companies with Indian operations, provided they get approval from the RBI.
This slide really illustrates how administrative the whole thing is. We're not talking about court appearances here. It's basically a paper trail. You file a notice, get a critical solvency certificate from your auditor, submit the approved scheme, and then get the final order. It's all managed through a clear, straightforward set of forms.
All right, now for the fun part. Let's put the two paths side by side. Because when you do a head-to-head comparison, the advantages of the fast-track merger really pop. At its very core, this is the fundamental difference we're talking about. The fast-track merger is an exercise of administrative power. The old way is an exercise of judicial power. One is a review by a director, the other is a full-blown, lengthy legal proceeding in a tribunal.
This table just breaks it all down perfectly. The authority shifts from the court to a regional director. The timeline, well, it drops from years to a maximum of 120 days. Now here's an interesting detail. The approval threshold is actually higher for the fast-track route, at 90% by value. But then you get this other crucial benefit, deemed approval. If the director doesn't act within 60 days, it's a go. That kind of thing just never happens in a court system.
The philosophy behind the fast-track merger is what some call A-frame logic. The goal is just to create a clean, seamless transfer of everything, assets, liabilities, people, from one company to the other without getting tangled up in legal knots. This ensures the business can keep running smoothly through the whole transition.
Now, it's not a perfect system, of course. So for a balanced picture, we need to talk about the challenges that still exist and take a peek at what the future might hold for this framework.
90%, this number right here, is probably the single biggest bottleneck in the whole process. Getting shareholders and creditors who represent 90% of the value to all agree on the deal,
Well, that can be incredibly tough, especially if you have a lot of smaller investors.
And it's not just about that high approval threshold. There are other hurdles. Stamp duty laws, for example, can be different from state to state, which adds a layer of complexity. There's also still some gray area around the tax rules for demergers using this route. And while that 90% threshold is there to protect minority shareholders, it can also give a small group enough power to stall a deal that's good for the majority.
But the outlook is definitely positive. The whole process is moving toward being 100% digital. There's also a big push to get different regulatory bodies, like the RBI and CB, to coordinate better. And who knows? We could see the government expand the fast-track umbrella to include even more types of companies, making it an even more powerful tool.
And that leaves us with one final big-picture question to think about. The fast-track merger is a huge shift away from slow judicial oversight toward quick administrative approval. As the pace of business just keeps getting faster, it really makes you wonder, should this become the model for all of corporate law?